Welcome everybody to the 11th of our 14-part series on, we have a new title here, New Frontiers in Food Policy and Food Security in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. It's a symposium series we've been running for over a year now with excellent speakers, and we're really very excited today to have two of the best. So we haven't been using them up yet. We've got two great speakers today. Today's program is going to focus on the role of trade in improving food security in sub-Saharan Africa. And as we get started, I'll introduce myself. I'm Roz Naylor. I direct the Center on Food Security and the Environment. And with Wally Falcon, have been running the symposium series here at FSE. So this is going to be a 2-hour event. We'll talk and have discussion. The talks will range for about an hour, hour and a half, and then discussion for 45 minutes or so. And please keep your questions short. I'm going to be calling on all of you. My tendency is always to call on students first, so don't be bashful. And as you know from having attended this seminar in other periods, that we also are doing a remote learning seminar with mid-career professionals in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So we welcome all of you in this room and all of you from other parts of the world. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We have Professor Kim Anderson and Professor Joe Swinnen here as the discussant. And they both have a lot in common. They're both extremely distinguished economists, world citizens, global agriculturalists, as I'll tell you in a moment, and each has authored more than 15 books and hundreds of papers. So I could go on and on. I'm starting early because I'm going to be up here talking for about 45 minutes myself about these two. No. Well, the other thing you should know about them, Wally and I were talking about how they're really both one-off alcoholics. You should know that Kim Anderson edits the Journal of Wine Economics, and Joe Swinnen has just published a very popular book on the economics of beer. So we'll be discussing this after the session in our reception. So let me give you a more formal introduction. I'd like to start with Kim Anderson, our lead speaker today. Kim, you'll notice in just a moment, is Australian. He doesn't speak like we do here, but I think you'll be able to understand most of what he says. He is the George Gollan Professor of Economics at the University of Adelaide. He was formerly the executive director at the Center for International Studies at Adelaide and has also been a professor at the Department of Economics at Australia National University, ANU, in Canberra. He's done his undergraduate work in Australia, his graduate work at Chicago, and also here at Stanford. He was a graduate with PhD here at the Food Research Institute in 1977. He's been a visiting professor at many major universities, both in Europe and North America. He's a fellow at the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, a distinguished fellow and past president of the Australian Association for Ag Economists, and he's currently a trustee at IFPRI, which is one of the leading food policy research organizations in Washington, D.C. So I could go on about his hundreds of journal articles and numerous books. I'll just say that if you have read Kim's work or are planning to read more of it, his main themes are on globalization, trade reform and negotiation, the costs of trade distortions, and more generally, agricultural incentives as they relate to trade and food policy. And of course, he's very interested in wine, so any question on wine will definitely get the best of him. So actually, he's very well known for a multi-volume set of studies, and I have one here that's very relevant to this particular session, Distortions to Agricultural Incentives in Africa. This is a multi-volume set that was co-edited by William Masters, who was an earlier discussant in this series, done when he was a visiting scholar at the World Bank, and this is published in 2009. So I could go on, but we welcome you, and I'll just let Kim display his own wisdom to you as he comes up. But before you do that, I want to say a few notes about Johan Swinnen, who is from Belgium, and his home base is the University of Louvain. And while he's at home, he's in Louvain, but he's really all over the world. So try to track this guy down. It's actually not very easy, but he usually responds to email. And He's been visiting professor in many major universities throughout Europe and the United States. And we're actually very delighted to have him as a multi-year visitor here at the Center on Food Security and the Environment. So this is one of his visits. He's been working a lot with our colleague Scott Rosell, who is sitting here in the front. Joe has a PhD in agricultural economics from Cornell in 1992. And since that time, he's been going through the ranks at the University of Louvain. He is now a professor of development studies, the director of the Center for Institutions and Economic Performance, and also a senior research fellow at the Center for European Studies in Brussels. Many of you may know him because he was the recent past president of the International Agricultural Economics Association. So he's very, very well known in this field. He's advised numerous institutions, many organizations on food policy and agricultural issues. And he's had incredibly numerous and productive collaborations in Asia, Africa, Europe, Australia, North America. So he's really published on a wide variety of regions and topics. So I'm not going to outline hundreds of articles, 17 books we counted. There's probably been a few more since he's been here since the weekend, but anyway, it's really hard to keep track of these two. But his main themes are on food aid, have been on food aid, supply chains, food prices, and globalization and trade, and of course, beer. So we'll hear more about that later. So Kim, I'll have you come up first, and then Joe, and the pillar is yours, and we welcome both of you. Very excited to hear what you have to say.
Thanks very much, Ros. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Stanford, and a bit intimidating to have my professors sitting in the seats here, but it is always lovely to come back to this part of the world and take in the wine region as well as the nice climate and all that. I should say at the outset I'm no great expert on sub-Saharan Africa, but that was the topic given to me, so what I will try and do is put that in a global context and see what we can draw out of that. So I thought I'd first talk about how trade can contribute to food security conceptually. No equations, no supply and demand diagrams, but just conceptually at the outset so that we can all be at least on the same page, or at least you can understand what page I'm on with respect to that. And then empirically look at some data on the extent to which sub-Saharan Africa has taken advantage of trade opportunities that could indeed improve food security on that continent. And then in the light of that, talk about what policy options are there for furthering food security and what role trade might play as part of that. And it's pretty obvious why we should focus on sub-Saharan Africa, because it is where a huge number of the ultra-poor are. About 70% of the world's ultra-poor are now in that region, and that was a huge growth from just 12% in the early 80s. But the other reason, I think, is that the governments of sub-Saharan Africa are somewhat belatedly looking increasingly at strategies for getting pro-poor growth. And so what was going on in Asia in the 60s and beyond is now looking to be happening quite a bit more in Africa. So it's a good time to engage with policy advisors and makers there. So what I have in mind for food security is what the FAO has in mind, that it has these three key elements: availability, but not availability in the sense of self-sufficiency. That's what people tried to do 10,000 years ago because there was no option, but availability that normally would come through markets unless people were able to produce their food cheaper themselves, but that almost is never the case except for one or two products. The second element is access, so it's not just having the food available, but having enough of it for a healthy and active life at all times, including crisis times like we had in 2008 when prices spiked for cereals. And that clearly depends on the capacity to purchase. That might be via credit in a price spike period, or the people have access to gifts from family or entitlements to government programs or whatever. So that's the second element, and then the third is utilisation, where not only do you need to have the access to food, but you need to know how to make good use of it by choosing healthy and nutritious food for all household members. And the evidence is that capacity to utilise food well improves with education, and that depends always on how much income or assets you've got. So the best way to enhance food security from my point of view then is simply to efficiently raise spending power of countries or spending power of households or individuals. So at the macro or the global sense, what that means is raising the level and the growth rate of low-income countries. They're the most food insecure. And at the micro level of the household or the individual, raising their real incomes and asset values, at least of the poorest or the most food insecure folks. And if that can then improve their access to food markets, and if they've got higher income or wealth, access to education, and hence better utilisation of food. So, so how can trade then contribute to food security with that sort of concept of food security in mind? Well, it contributes because it's able to raise incomes. It can raise them through the normal sort of static national gains from trade, or the more interesting and worthwhile dynamic gains from trade. And even if a food insecure group of households doesn't benefit directly from engaging in trade, opening up an economy to trade, some of them can, some of the gains that others get can be redistributed to them so that everybody could, in principle, be better off. So I'm going to focus on trade policies, but in fact trade costs are similarly able to influence incomes, and trade costs are higher in sub-Saharan Africa than any other region. And so if governments or individuals can find ways to lower those trade costs, then it can have the same sorts of benefits. But trade reform, trade policy reform, is actually much quicker and easier in an economic sense at least, because it just requires the stroke of the legislator's pen, if only you can convince them to pick it up and sign. Whereas to lower trade costs, you have to invest in things like infrastructure for transport, communications and so on. So where are the sources of gain from trade? They could come from exchange. If you have an endowment difference from mine and we have the same taste, we could exchange goods, or if we have, or vice versa. So that's the simplest type of gain from trade. But the more normal way of getting gains is through production specialisation. It could be between households, between regions within the country, for example, where groups exploit their comparative cost advantages. And those types of gains, of course, can apply to international trade as well. But these gains from trade, even in just looking at it from a static point of view, can be greater, typically the poorer and smaller an economy, because these gains are greater if you've got scope to exploit economies of scale that you can't exploit in a closed small economy, for example. It can bring greater competitiveness in domestic markets and reduce the extent to which monopolists are exploiting the rest of the society. It can bring greater variety of goods and services and higher quality of goods and services. And so all of those things are beneficial outcomes from opening up to trade. But the much bigger gains are dynamic, and it's always been hard for economists to grapple with this, but the evidence is so overwhelming. Even just casual empiricism suggests that economies that embrace openness tend to grow faster, and there's virtually no example of a rapidly growing economy that has not been open to trade. And it boosts economic growth in a number of ways. It creates a climate for investment that's more attractive than otherwise. It brings in new ideas, new ways of not just producing, but of distributing, of marketing, of financing your operations. and it tends to speed up technological change. We can just avoid time-consuming knowledge creation simply by adopting and adapting from abroad. But how does this affect households if there's no redistribution of those gains? Well, it means that a food surplus developing country, for example, removed a restriction on exports, which is what happened a lot in Africa in recent decades, then the net sellers of that food would benefit, and they'd benefit in proportion to their marketed output, but that would be at the expense of the net buyers of food in that country. And the opposite would be the case for a food deficit country if it reduced a restriction on its food imports. But that's just the direct effect. Then there's an important indirect effect, a general equilibrium effect that you need to capture via factor markets. And that is that if you remove a trade measure that had in the past, for example, lowered farmers' product prices, and that raises the demand for labour on farms, then especially in agrarian economies, as in Africa, where a large proportion of the unskilled workforce is engaged in agriculture, then that raises unskilled wages and that spills over into non-farm jobs as well. And so it's quite possible, even if a price of food were to rise through liberalisation, that net buyers of food may gain more from an increase in their wage rates than they lose from the increase in the price of food. So that's an empirical issue, and you need a good model to be able to try and capture that if you're interested in estimating it. But if there's this possibility of redistribution of gains from trade, then provided the government can and does efficiently tax and redistribute some of the gains from trade opening, then it can compensate anyone who might be adversely affected. So if farmers, for example, very poor farmers were net buyers of food, they could still benefit if the government used some of those gains from trade to invest in things like rural education, health or infrastructure or agricultural research and development. And as in lots of parts of Africa where many people have migrated off farms and gone into urban slums in the hope of getting a higher paying job there, some of those folks might get attracted back to the rural areas if there was now more profitable activities to be had there. And that would reduce urban poverty and not necessarily increase rural poverty if there's new opportunities there. So that's looking at it just from an individual small country point of view. What about from the point of view of the world as a whole? There's distortions out there that have been changing over time. We'll look at that in a moment, but those empirical studies suggest that the current distortions we have around the world would, if removed, raise food prices somewhat. And that means that some of the food surplus developing countries would benefit if those international prices were to go up, but food deficit developing countries, of which there are many in Africa, would lose, other things equal. And then within each of those countries there would be the net sellers of food who would benefit directly at the expense of the net buyers. But again, just remember that indirect effect of such a change on unskilled wages. Okay, so trade measures then are really an nth best, they're nowhere near a first best way of trying to improve food security because they reduce the overall efficiency of global resource use in agriculture. We're growing things in the wrong places, and so that undermines global food security. And while it may help some poor households to have the sort of restrictions we might have in place at the moment, it's usually at the expense of other poor households, and it's also unnecessarily helping some, and often many, non-poor groups, and in a regressive way. The bigger you are as a farmer, for example, the more you're benefiting from farm price supports. So it's a very, very blunt social protection instrument, and we can surely do much better than use that as a means of trying to secure our food supplies. So the key messages so far then, if you've fallen asleep, 2 points. One is that to improve food security requires increasing the spending power of society's most vulnerable groups. And so it's fundamentally a consumption issue. And it so often gets confused with things like national food self-sufficiency, which is not at all the same sort of concept. That might be a way of encouraging production, but if it's done through a trade measure, it's simultaneously discouraging consumption if you raise the price of food domestically, and so that's undermining poor households, net by households' food security. And trade policy reform potentially can boost spending power quickly if governments are willing, with the stroke of a pen to alter trade restrictive legislation. Okay, well, how fully has sub-Saharan Africa taken advantage of trade opportunities relative to what other parts of the world have been doing over the past 50 odd years? And here I'll draw on the project's output that Ros mentioned in the introduction from a recent World Bank project. Well, if you look at the very long run, over the 20th century, the real international price of food fluctuated a lot, but around a long-run trend that was declining at about a bit over 0.5% a year. That contrasts with what we've seen in the last decade, though, where that short-term price trend has been upwards. But both of those trends have been affected by government policies in both rich and poor countries, and therefore have affected the food security of sub-Saharan Africa through the price of food in international markets. So that's the picture for the 20th century, lots of woggles around a quite clear long-run trend. And then for this period of the last 12 years, you can see it's been slightly rising until the middle of the last decade, and then we've had 3 price spikes in a very short time, 5 years, which is probably unprecedented in, well, it's certainly not very common to get that many spikes in such a short time. I'll come back to that a bit later and just focus on that long-run trend at the moment and look at the way in which governments have responded to that and through that contributed via their policies to that price trend. So in the high-income countries, they used quite variable import restrictions and sometimes export subsidies to both protect and to insulate farmers from that long-run falling international price. Whereas in developing countries, they used, again, variable measures, but typically the dominant one was agricultural export restrictions, but they also had overvalued and multiple exchange rates that affected those prices farmers received, and manufacturing tariffs also tended to influence the profitability of agriculture versus industrial activities. So all of those things were in place for various reasons: to raise government revenue, to boost industrialisation in newly independent countries, to placate the urban demands for lower and less volatile food prices. So often they were trying to reduce the instability of domestic prices through these measures, as well as altering the trend level of them. Well, the consequences of that up until the early 80s was that these high-income country policies were depressing international food prices, and the policies of developing countries were doing the opposite. They were making less food available in international markets and hence raising international prices. And some modelling work we did back in the early 90s suggested that in that period up to the 80s, those two things tended to more or less offset each other. And so the international prices perhaps were not much different than they would have been under free trade. But 2 other features were important about those policies. One is that there was that anti-trade bias of policies thinned international markets. And the most extreme case is rice, where only a few % of world production has been traded internationally. And when you've only got a small volume of trade, you've got much more scope for food price fluctuations. And the other feature of it was that these were variable trade restrictions aimed at insulating the domestic market from international price fluctuations, which also meant that those international prices fluctuated more. Well, since the 80s, though, we've had a great deal of reform. There's been a reduction in these farm price supports in high-income countries, not all, but a lot. and there's been some re-instrumentation of support for farmers in those countries away from directly price distorting measures, which begs the question, is this short-term or is this a permanent change? And will we see other forms of support come in place of those traditional measures, such as the biofuel subsidies of recent years? In developing countries, the negative assistance to farmers, or the disincentives they faced, they've been reduced with the economic development we've seen over the last quarter century. And by and large, on average, that degree of distortion has gone close to zero. And that raises the question, is it going to stop at zero, a neutral sort of situation, or are we going to see these countries move from taxing to subsidising their farmers as their economy keeps growing? Well, this is the details of this distortions database that I mentioned that was created as part of a World Bank project. It goes from the 1950s, mid-50s. It includes a huge number of products and 82 countries that account for over 90% of the world economy. So what we try and measure there is something called the nominal rate of assistance to farmers, which you can think of as the percent by which the domestic gross value of farm production exceeds what it would have done without national government interventions in that country's agricultural markets. So this is the trend of that nominal rate of assistance averaged across all high-income countries, and you can see clearly this growth of agricultural protection up to the mid-80s, and subsequently an equally, even faster rate of decline in those rates of assistance. So we're back to now a level that was not seen since the 1950s. In the developing countries, on the other hand, we had this negative nominal rate of assistance at more than minus 20% in the 60s and 70s, and then suddenly this reform, and you can see how those nominal rates have risen and even shot across zero a bit in the most recent decade or so. You can also see in both these graphs a lot of wiggles, and the wiggles are inversely correlated, as we'll see shortly, with the international prices. So in the mid-70s there, in 73-4, international prices spiked up. That meant nominal rates came down. Farmers didn't need to be supported as much during that high price period. The opposite occurred in the mid-80s when the US and Europeans were in an export subsidy war. International prices plummeted downwards and nominal rates of assistance went up. We're currently in a similar situation to what it was in the mid-70s with our price spike of recent years. Okay, there's one other indicator that we measure in this work, and that is called the relative rate of assistance, which you can think of as the percent by which the domestic price of all farm goods relative to non-farm tradable product prices exceeds what that ratio would be in international markets, or exceeds what it would be without government interventions, not only in the country's food markets and other goods markets, but also in the foreign exchange market. So that rate is made up of these two components, the agricultural nominal rate of assistance and the non-agricultural nominal rate. So the middle line here is the agricultural rate for developing countries aggregated over all of them. And you can see that was around minus 20% back in the 60s and 70s, and then has gone up to positive numbers. The upper dark line is the rate for non-agricultural tradables, that's mostly manufactures, and you can see that was very high in the early period in the 60s and so on, 40% tariffs on average, that type of thing, and those have come down to less than 5% now. So the bottom line is the relative rate of assistance. That was very highly negative, minus 50% back in the 60s. It's now close to zero. So this has been a very important development, the fact that there's been these two components to it, and they've been roughly equally important. The drop in the nominal rate of assistance to non-agriculture simultaneously with a rise in the nominal rate to farmers. And it means that governments have been doing a lot in developing countries for farmers since the 1980s, both indirectly by getting rid of these manufacturing tariffs and multiple exchange rates, and directly, especially in Africa, where there was a lot of export taxation that has now diminished. dramatically. And I think this is a message that gets less attention than the message about the decline in investment and official development assistance for agriculture since the mid-1980s. That was a negative for developing country agriculture, but this policy development was a positive for them. How did Africa look relative to the others? Well, Africa is the flattest of those three lines and Asia is the steepest of them. So you can see Africa was not as distorted, this is the relative rate of assistance, not as distorted in the 60s and 70s as Asia and to a lesser extent Latin America, and now we have the opposite situation. So there hasn't been as much change in Africa as in Asia. So if we look at this is looking at the global farm population on the horizontal axis here, and looking at what the relative rate of assistance is if you put them in here sequentially. So this big blob here is China. It's got a long base because it's a large number of people in agriculture back in the 1980s, and this one here is India. And China and India have both gone to basically zero relative rate of assistance in the most recent decade. So they're this bit in here. It's not as long now because there's less people in agriculture in that part of the world. But this bit here is a lot of Africa. And where is that now? Well, that's over here. So it's still negative, but it's not as negative, and it's a much smaller proportion of the total population. So the fact that the shaded areas has shrunk over the more recent period between the 80s and the more recent decade is a good sign, but there's still a group there that are negatively affected by government policies. So what does all this mean for food security in sub-Saharan Africa? This fast rise in that relative rate of assistance in Asia has been very important, I think. It helps explain the relatively fast agricultural growth we've seen there, and in particular in China and India, this absence of a decline in food self-sufficiency there. They have reasonably maintained their self-sufficiency because they've been effectively raising the price farmers have received for products over the past 20 or 30 years. But by having done that, it means that the international food prices have risen less than they would have since the 80s, than they would have in the absence of that Asian reform. So this is good for sub-Saharan African and other net buyers of food. It's not so good though if you're a farmer, you've lost some international competitiveness to Asia if you're sitting in Africa. Okay, well, it might look from those diagrams as if we've pretty well got rid of these distortions in world agriculture, but that's not so for a number of reasons. One is that there's still a wide cross-country dispersion of these nominal rates of assistance within both the high-income country and the developing country groups. And there's a very wide cross-product dispersion of nominal rates within each country's agricultural sector. And both of those things mean we still haven't yet allocated the world's agricultural resources very efficiently. And there are also, of course, some distortions that don't show up as wedges between the domestic and border price, and hence they're not captured here, things like biofuel subsidies and the mandates for that, and the water subsidies. So that's the dispersion across countries in the early part of last decade. You can see it's a very wide dispersion with countries like Switzerland and Norway up the top end, and Zimbabwe and Cote d'Ivoire at the bottom end. And if you do the global averages of these nominal rates by product, you again get these export crops from perennials down the bottom there, and sugar, cotton and milk up the top. So how far has the world come in this period since the early 80s in terms of liberalisation? We did a backcasting using a global economy-wide model, and estimated that we've come about 3/5 of the way towards freeing up markets, not only for farm products but also for non-farm products over that period since the early 80s. So that's huge progress by the standards of history, but it still means there's 2/5 of the way to go. We also followed up with a project on looking at how these price distortions have affected inequality and poverty. We had some global models to look at that, and we had a whole series of national economy-wide models to look at that, where the household income and expenditure distributions were built into the models, and you could get a sense of what would happen if we were to remove the remaining distortions to agricultural incentives and to non-farm products as well. By and large, it's not always one outcome, but by and large, from all of those studies collected in that book, the story was that you would certainly benefit developing countries more than high-income countries proportionately. There would be a reduction in both global and national poverty in virtually all of those country case studies, and there would be a reduction in income inequality. So this provides yet another reason why we should try and push for freer trade. It does all those good things, and of course that will also mean greater global and, in these cases, national food security. That book's freely available as an e-book on the World Bank website if you're interested. Let's look now at what's been happening within sub-Saharan Africa, though, and a couple of things stand out. One is that there is still this strong anti-trade bias in the assistance provided to various types of producers within sub-Saharan Africa, and the rate of assistance tends to be less negative or slightly positive even for food staples as compared with non-staple farm products. So you can see here the blue line is the nominal rate of assistance to sub-Saharan Africa on average across all the farm products. The red one tells you what it is for the import competing subsector of agriculture, and the green one of what it does for the exporting sector. So you can see there's still export taxation there. It's half what it was before, but it hasn't disappeared. And meanwhile, there is import protection for the import competing parts of the farm sector in agriculture. And if you split it as between staples and non-staples, the staples were anything that contributed more than 10% to calorie intake. So it's basically the grains plus bananas and so on in Uganda. You can see that it was positive, so they were probably import competing and they had protection against those imports earlier on. It's now basically zero for the staples, and it's still negative for the non-staples. Now that's really important for food security because it means that the folks who are trying to produce those non-staples in which they may have a strong comparative advantage, other things equal, such as export cash crops, are being discouraged from earning income from that and therefore discouraged from being able to improve their food security, even if the price of staples is not that much, not too much distorted. And that's the picture just for a few commodities to give you an idea of what's going on. Okay, what about one of the failed parts of that project? I was hoping to do a book on what this does for growth, and I couldn't find enough people who were interested, and couldn't find any who were interested in working on it. But I now see that Swinner's doing a piece on it, and one of our recent staff members from Barcelona, Marcus Bruckner, had a go with me too. And so this paper is available on the web. I won't go through it now, but it was aimed at trying to test that proposition econometrically, that these reductions in distortions in Africa have in fact added not only to agricultural growth, have added to overall economic growth because they've got rid of those distortions as between agriculture and non-agriculture. And it comes out with quite strong and sizable econometric effects. So the point is that it's unfortunate then that there isn't more reform occurring in sub-Saharan Africa, given that it can have this growth effect. Of course, it could also slow the decline in international competitiveness of African farmers and hence make them able to raise their incomes and therefore their food security. So the second set of key messages then is that trade reforms since the 80s have gone a long way towards liberalising food markets. It looks like about 3/5 of the way as of 2004, but there still are many policies that continue to cause an inefficient use of agricultural resources both in Africa and elsewhere, and hence are undermining African food security. Let me turn then away from long-run trends towards fluctuations around those trends, and we've seen a lot of those fluctuations in, as I said, 3 price spikes in this last 5 years. And so let's have a look at this globally and then at sub-Saharan Africa. There's those 3 price spikes again in 2008 and 2010 and most recently this last summer, your summer. So what happens conceptually then if you have this sort of spike and there's a temporary alteration in a country's trade restrictions aiming at trying to stabilise the domestic price so it doesn't transmit as much of that increase to the home market. The developing countries have tended to do that either through increasing export restrictions or imposing new ones, or if they're competing with imports for that, they've lowered or suspended their tariffs on imports. And they have, the evidence will show they do the opposite when prices slump. I won't talk about it today, but it's very important to keep that in mind because a lot of developing countries have been arguing in the WTO for the Doha round to adopt something called the Special Safeguards Mechanism, which would be designed to allow these countries to do that, to raise their tariffs when prices slump. And the story that comes out of looking at the price spikes here is equally applicable there, and the conclusion will be that it's a very inappropriate policy from a food security point of view. Okay, so if we have these interventions, and we have had them in these last few years, altering barriers, they are benefiting net buyers of food at the expense of net sellers relative to what it would be under free markets or unchanged barriers to trade, and it's doing it in both the food surplus and the food deficit countries. But you need to go beyond thinking about what it does for one country and ask what happens if many countries do this. And in fact, you'll see the evidence is that many countries do temporarily impose or increase export restrictions or lower their import restrictions when international food prices spike upwards. Well, what it does is exacerbate this international price change, and hence it makes the domestic price in third countries that are not engaged in this policy change, they are faced with an even steeper price rise for themselves, which harms their net buyers of food even more and helps their net sellers, of course. You always get these distributional effects with trade. But it also reduces the adjustment by both producers and consumers, and so it prolongs the period that you're going to have this price spike relative to what it would be if you had open markets. With open markets, producers, since you've got two hemispheres, can respond within 6 months, and you can usually get over those spikes quite quickly. But if a lot of countries close in and don't engage in adjustment, then it just prolongs that spike. Now, if many countries are doing this, and if an equal proportion of importers and exporters of food are doing this, then it turns out that they are offsetting each other in terms of their effect on trade. The exporters are reducing what they want to export. The importers, by suspending their tariffs, are raising the quantities they want to import. And if they had equal weights in the world market, they would offset each other. You might get no change at all in the volume of trade. And therefore, you would get no change in what the domestic prices would do. They would rise as much as they would have if no countries altered their trade restrictions at all. So it's a bit like people standing up in the stadium. You tend to have no better view if everybody stands up in the stadium. So it's a futile thing if both importers and exporters are doing this equally. Okay, what's the evidence then? Well, the evidence is that the nominal rates of assistance tend to be negatively correlated with movements in international product prices, and that applies both up and down, which means countries are insulating to some extent. How much? A lot. You can see, the legend there doesn't show it, but the dotted line there is the nominal rate of assistance for rice in sub-Saharan Africa, and you can see it's got a pretty strong negative correlation with that heavy line, which is the international price of rice. The correlation coefficient is about 0.8 for that period since 1970. That's the one for maize. The correlation coefficient is not as high, but you can see the nominal rate is even more wiggly than the international price line, and that's because the governments have been intervening here not very efficiently, not timing their interventions very well, and actually stuffing up the markets a bit. Okay, so the second point is that on average, when we look across this sample of 82 countries, barely half of the change in international prices are transmitted to domestic markets within the first year on average across that sample. Now, partly that's because of trade costs, that's a friction in the system, but it's also because of altering government barriers. So that's the short-run price transmission elasticity, what can happen within 1 year. On average, it's just above 0.5, and it's even lower than 0.5 for rice. That's the most insulated of all the important grains. So if we look at this period of 2006 to 2008, for example, when we had the steepest price rise, a threefold increase in the price of rice, for example, it's possible to do a back-of-the-envelope exercise, and in this paper we did that last year. If you assume that the supply can't respond, there's not enough stocks there, that's it's an annual crop that can't instantly respond, and if you assume the national demand elasticities are equal, then this calculation simply means getting this alteration in the trade tax equivalent and doing it with a consumption weight across the world, and you'll get a sense of how much impact this insulating policy globally is having on exacerbating this international price rise. So that's the extent of the international price rise over that 3-year period. So more than a doubling in the price of rice and a little bit less for the other two grains. And the question is, how much of that rise was because of government intervention by altering their barriers to trade? Well, it turns out that's the proportion. So in the case of maize, 1/10 of that rise is due to government policy alterations. 1/5 of the wheat price rise is due to that, and 2/5 of the rice price rise is because of that action by governments. So the left-hand column here is a repeat of how much those prices rose over that period, and the second column in red there is netting out the effect of government policies, how much they would have risen had governments not altered their trade restrictions during this period. Then you can compare on the right-hand side by how much domestic prices actually rose for these three grains. So if you look at wheat, for example, in all developing countries and in Africa, they rose by about 50%. Rice, I'm talking about the first row. But the international price more than doubled. So you say, oh, gee, government policies actually did a lot. They had, the price rise was less than half what the international price rise was. The problem is, had they not intervened, the international price would have only risen by 2/3 to 68%, by 68%. So there's not a big difference between that 50 and 68%. Maize, it's even less. And in the case of wheat, if you look at Africa, its price went up 90%. Internationally, it only went up 70%, and if you net out government activities, it would have only gone up 56%. So clearly there's a lot of intervention going on in markets that's very inefficient. It's actually leading to a higher price rise domestically than internationally. There's a number of economists, including ones who have spoken in this series, who've documented that activity of marketing agencies in Africa that have not been very efficient at doing their job. So the bottom line then for sub-Saharan Africa is that even if its insulation from international price spikes could prevent some people from becoming more food insecure, the number of people that are saved from going into poverty by such action is actually a lot less than the government might think when it just compares how much its price rose domestically compared with how much the international price rose. And it's because these many other countries are intervening and pushing up that international price even further. And meanwhile, of course, the net sellers of food were denied the opportunity to take a full advantage of that price rise, and thereby were not able to contribute to to economic output at that time. Okay, so what are some domestic policy implications? Let me lead towards wrapping up here. Of course, it's possible that countries could get together and agree to desist from doing this sort of thing. And in the African context, where a lot of trade is just across borders and so on, there might be some sense in doing that, to agree to desist from using export restrictions when international prices rise. And then look at alternative policies. And one obvious one is, if you had the cash, a consumption subsidy. Now, a consumption subsidy is half of what a trade measure is. A trade restriction is a production tax and a consumption subsidy. That is a export tax is the combination of a production tax and a consumption subsidy. So if you only have a direct consumption subsidy, you're not getting that extra distortion on the production side, but you're also avoiding beggaring your neighbour by pushing up the international price of the product you're intervening with. But you can do a lot better than just a general consumption subsidy. The information and communication technology revolution has made it possible for countries to target needy households. And so we're seeing conditional cash e-transfers becoming a more and more common way in which governments can provide social protection for all sorts of things. And it can be broad-based, and this could be just one activity in which they might make use of that sort of policy measure, and it would be vastly more efficient, far more targeted. It wouldn't involve huge government outlays because you could just target it ideally at the most vulnerable households. But of course, in this part of the world, as in other parts of the world, food import dependence is still a politically sensitive topic, and it's likely to become more the case in sub-Saharan Africa as we see climate change come along. They're going to be adversely affected by that in their agriculture, and the boom in China, of course, is driving a minerals rapidly expanding demand for minerals around the world, and Africa has a lot of minerals, and so there's a lot of mining booms going on there like there is in Australia, and that's putting upward pressure on the exchange rate, and that's making it more difficult for agriculture to produce. So there's a prospect that this set of countries is going to, at least a subset of them, is going to become more food import dependent in coming years. Not necessarily poorer though, they might be gaining from the mining boom and able to afford that. So the pressure will be on to, it will be populist for governments that have democratic elections to buy into this and to raise import barriers when self-sufficiency looks like it will decline. But there are many other things you could do better. And certainly one of those is to reduce the underinvestment there already is in agricultural R&D on that continent. And that could boost, shift out the supply curve, raise the amount of domestic supply, benefit consumers at the same time as benefiting producers, and avoid having to use import restrictions as a way of feeling more food secure. And of course you could go one further and remove the ban on GMO technology, and that would speed this process and encourage the private sector to come into the agricultural R&D business there a bit more too. Why do I say there's underinvestment there? Well, there's been a huge amount of work done on the rates of return to agricultural investment in general. They're very high around the world, but they would be especially high in sub-Saharan Africa because that is where there is the least spending on agricultural R&D. It's only about 0.5% of agricultural GDP in recent years. That compares with more than 1% in the rest of the world and more than 0.75% in Africa back in the 60s and 70s. This decline in the research intensity in the continent is presumably a contributor to the relatively low rate of productivity growth that Africa had for quite a few decades. Just back to that issue about trade costs, if it's the case that even if you have trade reform, there isn't much expansion in trade, and it's because of high trade costs, then obviously there is a possible high rate of return for investing in infrastructure to lower those trade costs. That could be in rural areas, getting roads and so on organised so farmers can get their product to market cheaper, and in communication so they can learn about opportunities to sell their product in other parts of the country, for example. Finally, the implications for the WTO's Doha development agenda. That of course is, if it could be resurrected, is trying to bring about lower agricultural protection rates in high-income countries, It could reduce the risk of agricultural protection growth in rapidly industrialising countries such as China and India, and it could encourage less insulation of domestic markets by both rich and poor countries. What it's got on its agenda currently is to reduce bound tariffs and subsidies in agriculture, but if it was resurrected, then one could add similar bindings to export restrictions to reduce this international public bad that comes out of beggar thy neighbour insulation. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Ros, and there's some of the references there to our work.
Let me first thank the organizers for inviting me here. I particularly want to thank Ross and Wally because they have been, it's been a great pleasure having come here for the past almost 2 years now and basically being part of the Stanford environment. I mean, FSC is a really wonderful place to be. It also allows me to get away from my own institute, so I have some time to write and think here uninhibited by other institute things that you have to do. I also especially want to thank Scott Rosell. Scott's been a friend of mine and collaborator for many, many years now, and without him I probably wouldn't be here as well. I'm standing here in the footsteps of great men because Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, was standing right here a couple of days ago, and now Kim Madison just was in front of me. It's a mixed blessing to come after Kim. Okay, Kim's been such a incredible mind on the issues he talked about. He's been a dominant thinker and writer on these issues, and he has been continuously trying to apply trade theory and trade policy to very concrete and current policy issues, and try to push the limits of what we do know and what we do not know in terms of his modeling. And at the same time, as you undoubtedly heard him talking, he used what Alan Blinder used to call a soft heart and hard heads approach to it, okay, trying to push it. He covered so many different issues, and actually I started basically commenting on it when he sent me his draft, a PowerPoint, and then I said, I'm going to need 2 hours to discuss all his presentations, and I don't have 2 hours, I have 15 minutes. So, and the other thing is I think some of it is pretty provocative what he said, so I guess he'll get enough questions from you. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to make essentially talk about 4 different issues, which I think is complementary to what Kim said. In some cases, it's going to nuance the points he made or put some broader perspective on it. In another couple of issues, it's basically going to argue that the effects may be even stronger than what he was arguing. Okay, it's very much based on some of the research I've been doing with some colleagues over the past couple of years, a couple of months, and there's a list at the end also where you can find with papers where you can find more details if I go too fast. Okay, let me start with this thing. So I've written a couple of papers on this thing. It's called The Right Price of Food, okay? And it is inspired by my observation that our thinking on food policy, food security issues has changed quite dramatically over the past couple of years. So until 2007, 2008, the dominant concern was that low food prices were causing poverty, and food security was basically made worse in the developing world because the subsidies of rich countries were hurting poor farmers. And so trade policy discussions very much reflected this. There was emphasis on how should we remove rich countries' subsidies and tariffs so we can increase food prices, agricultural prices in the world, and that would be good for poverty and good for food security. Okay, so, and then since then it's totally changed. Okay, with the high prices, a lot of the concern is now on that these high food prices are causing poverty and food insecurity because they're harming the poor consumers in the world. And trade policy, as you've just heard, also reflected in Kim's presentation, is on how can we reduce export constraints to reduce food prices. Okay, and so one of the points I've been making is maybe as a profession we are not paying enough attention to, let's say, the good sides of the story here. Maybe before 2008 we should have had more attention to actually that poor consumers were actually benefiting from these low prices, and now to the fact that poor farmers are actually benefiting from the high prices, and maybe we need a more balanced perspective. When I was presenting these things over the past years, I've had several people come up to me or write to me and say, well, the right price of food is, for example, a fair price of food, okay? Or it's a stable price of food, right? Now, a fair price of food, I think we would all agree with that. The question is, how do you define a fair price of food? And which is difficult. So one of the reactions I got was from Stefan Tangeman. Stefan's a very well-known agricultural economist. He used to be for 10 years the head of the OECD Department on Trade and Agriculture. And he said the right price of food is the undistorted price of food. Okay? And to some extent, although Kim just has to make his own statements on that, it reflects a bit, I think, the presentation that Kim has made. The good thing about that definition, it's a clear definition. You can actually pinpoint it, okay? And it's a coherent statement. The issue with it, it doesn't detract from the fact that you can have very heterogeneous effects, okay? And that's my first major point I'm going to make. If you change prices or you change trade policy, which then causes different price effects on the domestic market, which means some people gain and some people lose. Now, the impact of that depends on whether you're a producer or you're a consumer, or whether you are both producing and consumers. And so essentially that you can draw the analogy both at the household level, okay, and at the country level, where you import most food or you export food, etc. It also depends on the nature of the prices going up, prices going down, and on the nature of the policy change. And I'll come back to that in a second. I have an asterisk here because in the early version of Kim's presentation, he had some line somewhere where he suggested things still to be done, and I don't think it was in his presentation now, was the simultaneous, for example, the removal of biofuel and irrigation subsidies. And I really liked his quote, his analogy that if everybody starts basically constraining the food thing to protect the high food price, then it's like everybody standing up in the stadium. Now, if you remove biofuel and irrigation subsidies simultaneously, like everybody sitting down again, okay? Because they actually have opposite effects in terms of the developing country impact on prices. Okay. Now, for example, why is this important? If you look at the quote, some of the slides he showed, for example, his latest data on African countries, actually, whether they have positive or negative NRAs, you will see that about 2/3 of them have negative NRAs, meaning they're still effectively taxing their farmers on average, and 1/3 has positive NRAs, which means that basically if you would liberalize the whole trade system, doing away, then you would expect, even within sub-Saharan Africa, opposite effects in these type of countries. And this is something which is important for us, I think. Why is it important for us? Well, certainly it's important to know that these things are going to happen, okay, as a policymaker. If you are in government, you certainly want to know that these things are going to happen, because you may have different effect for certain groups and your whole political survival will depend on it. If you work for policymakers, they are often at least as much interested in the distributional effects in a society than on the aggregate welfare effects for that reason. But also if we concern about poverty, about food security in society, we should be interested in these heterogeneous effects throughout society. So to give you an illustration of how that matters, okay, I've taken actually, this is also a global perspective. And this is from a study we did where we compared the reforms, the liberalization in Africa with that in China and in Eastern Europe. And let me just see if right. So these are the NRAs. This is actually taken from Kim's work on NRAs and some of it also from OECD. This is what happened in China with the liberalization. So we put at the year 0 is when countries kind of started to open up, allow trade liberalization or remove a lot of the trade constraints and remove a lot of the domestic price interventions, etc. And you see basically that in China we went from minus 60%, I mean these are really big numbers, to they're now over 0 here, right? And so they removed the taxation on their agriculture. This is Africa, so they went from minus 30 to close to 0, which Kim just showed. And this is Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. They were heavily subsidizing their farmers and they went to 0, okay? Now the effect is, of course, this is liberalization in all cases, the removal of government intervention from the market. But the effect is actually opposite if you compare China to the former Soviet Union, for example, in Eastern Europe. And so this is based on, Africa is not here, I'll come back to Africa in a second. So all these countries here liberalized, but the effect has been a dramatic increase in their relative prices for the farmers. This is Eastern Europe, and this is China and Vietnam. There you had the opposite effect for both trade liberalization and price liberalization, okay? And that's reflected in their agriculture production, okay? And so this is China, this is output in China, which basically went from 0, this is an 80% increase within 10 years. This is Eastern Europe, basically it was a big collapse, minus 30%, and this is Africa here, okay? I'll come back to Africa in a second. It actually looks more like China than Eastern Europe here. Now, what I'm doing now, I'm going to shift to another couple of data on, and this is specifically on Africa. This is from new work we've done where we used Afrobarometer data, which basically essentially Afrobarometer data are, they actually asked people in the country, have you been hungry? Okay, have you been hungry once this year or twice? Have you been hungry a lot or have you been hungry all the time? And they used that as indicators to measure food security. Now you can imagine all kinds of problems with that indicator. The advantage is it's an exposed observation. And a lot of the fantastic work, which for example is done by in the World Bank with Will Anderson and his team, what they do, they simulate the effects using very sophisticated data sets, okay, but it's a ceteris paribus analysis. What if nothing else will change? So this is really an indicator of what may have happened in reality. So what you see here, this is the change in food security. So if you go up there, it means it got worse. Going down, it got better. And this is net food importers. So these are the countries where essentially they are exporting food, and those are the ones which are importing food on average, okay, as a net trade status. And so what you see here, that there's a couple of interesting things. First of all, about half the countries are below the zero line. That means about half the countries actually food security improved during the period, and half of it went worse. But a lot of them are around zero here, okay? So, but you see that on average, the relationship is negative, which is consistent with what we expected, that those countries which are more importing have been hurt more with higher food prices than the ones which are more exporting. We have a similar relationship here, but now with growth. So this is per capita growth over this 3-year period, and you see what you expect. That's also consistent with what Tim said, that those countries which have grown more over this period have actually improved food security according to these indicators compared to the ones which have not grown over this period. Again, showing very heterogeneous effect even within sub-Saharan Africa. Okay? This is a small regression we did, urban versus rural food security effects. And there we find, so this is the 3 indicators. This is light food insecurity, this is severe, and this is very severe here. If you look at this one here, you see that the minus number here means that if you're living in the cities, you are less likely to be food insecure than if you live in the rural areas. People in the cities are typically richer than people in the rural areas, okay? But essentially here's the negative effect, meaning that when the prices went up, actually food security improved on average in the country, but the interaction effect here with urban areas means that it actually got worse in the cities. Okay, so the rural areas actually benefited, according to this indicator, from these increased prices. My next point is about the role that institutions play. Okay, something which Kim did not mention in his presentation. Let me show you, this is again the same graph as I just showed, okay? So now I've put it in per capita terms, and for Africa it matters quite a bit because you have a lot of population growth there. So actually if you look at it in per capita terms, output over this period since the start of the structural adjustment programs has been 0 in agriculture production. And so we were quite puzzled with that because we saw here that actually these terms of the NRAs were improving, so the taxation of farmers was being cut by 20 to 30%, and we said, why haven't we seen any growth there? And essentially, then we actually looked at this is productivity indicators. They roughly have the same picture. I'm going to skip these. Okay, and then we said, now let's see if we can disaggregate this a bit to get a feeling about maybe in some sectors being better than in others, and that's what we did. So we looked into 3 different categories of commodities, roots, tuber and pulses, and cereals. Actually, they're together in one here. Industrial crops and fruits and vegetables. And what you see is that they behave very differently, both in terms of how basically the policies have affected them, of policy change has affected them, and both in terms of their output developments with that. So you see that essentially here there's been not that much change in roots, tubers and pulses and in cereals. They're pretty flat. The big changes has been in fruit and vegetables, which actually there the taxation of farmers has been reduced very significantly, and particularly in industrial crops. And industrial crops, that's the traditional export sector. It's cotton, sugar, tea, cacao, and things like that, okay? Now what is remarkable, okay, and this is really paradoxical, if we then look at the output effects, then we see that the decline actually, okay, is in industrial crops. So despite the fact that the taxation has been cut most with the liberalization, they have actually declined in output. The growth has been primarily in fruit and vegetables, and to some extent in cereals and roots and tubers here. And the average is 0. So the 0 line on average hides huge differences within these subgroups. And so the question is why? Okay, and this is our hypothesis. So if we look at liberalization, the simple model is get the prices right. Okay, that's what we've been talking about. Okay, in reality, of course, there is much more going on than just a price setting. Okay, there's all kinds of other things happening in a market or in how products are exchanged. In a lot of cases, this is not actually true a market. So when we think about the market, it's in Chicago, for example, or it's in the local village market, right? Now, in a lot of cases, we don't have that. We have a lot of institutional organizations between, for example, the buyer of the product and the seller of the product. The buyer of the product may also be the person providing the land. It might be the person providing the inputs, etc. So if you integrate these things, okay, it turns out that a lot of things happen, okay? And to give you a feeling, the second quote here says, private agricultural marketing companies, so that's the companies buying the products, are in practice the sole providers of seasonal inputs to the small-scale farming communities. So the buyer of the product is also the input supplier of the product, which means if you're basically going to change the output prices, it may affect your input price supply, okay? And particularly in private exchanges, it is true that there's a lot of what we call hold-ups going on, contract breaches. So basically the person buying your tea or buying your cotton is also providing your seeds and your fertilizer. Now you have as a farmer an incentive essentially to either take the fertilizer or the seed, grow it and then sell it to somebody else or sell it to your neighbor, etc. So how do you control all this? How do you make that work? And that's in reality a really, really big problem in these exchange systems, okay? So we developed a model about it. I don't have time to go into that, okay? But what's crucial about these things is that our conclusions is that the value of the commodity, whether you have a low value commodity or a high value commodity, really will have a big impact on how these exchange systems are governed, whether this can be governed through the private sector or it's impossible to sustain it to the private sector. And basically that means that you may expect liberalization to have very different effects among countries and among commodities or supply chains, if you want. So richer countries and high value chains, they can do this in a private sector environment. And so there you expect a stronger positive output response to price liberalization. And this effect will be slower or negative even in poorer countries and lower value chains, okay? I can give you more details if you want to know. So this means essentially that the industrial crops, they're medium value products, okay, traditional exports. They are heavily dependent on external inputs, okay, almost all of them. And you see there's bit of liberalization being a shift from the public sector to the private sector, and there's a lot of problems in enforcing these contracts and making this new system work in the private sector. In the fruits and vegetables sector, there you have a mixture of, on the one hand, low value products, okay, with low inputs, okay, and they just benefit from the price increases because of the liberalization, and since they don't have external inputs, okay, they don't have problems with contract enforcement. And the high value product is the other extreme, okay? There you have, it's very highly managed, it's global supply chains which play a big role there, totally private sector and very intensively organized. But because the value is high, they can make it work by paying the farmers a good enough price, okay? And so this can explain, this one maybe this other explain, why you can have, despite the fact that you have this big increase in NRA, a decline in output, and here you have a very strong increase in output with the same type of basically liberalization things. So this brings me already to the global supply chains and the role of trade. This is a picture of the growth in fruit and vegetable exports in Africa. So they've grown dramatic over the past 50 years, and particularly they've picked up the last 20 years. And so a lot of this is now in what I call high value fruits and vegetables, flowers, same type of model, okay, in these things. And what's really surprising is that this has been possible despite the fact that the standards that we impose on them in the West as importers, the quality standards, safety standards, have increased tremendously. So this is a picture, just to illustrate that, this is a picture from the WTO where they have, it just shows you the dramatic increase in SPS rules that exist at the WTO. And there are some indicator of the increase in standards in global trade in this thing, okay? I can talk a long time about this, but let me then go to my last point, which is about the spillover and the general equilibrium effects. Kim has mentioned it at some point in this presentation about the wage effects, okay? I think the wage effects is something, and the labor market effect is something which we tend to underestimate how important it is. And they're particularly important for the poorest people, because poor people don't have land, okay? So all they have is their labor, okay? And that makes these general equilibrium labor market effect extremely important. So there's new estimates from Will Martin's group at the World Bank, and they have now extended their models, and they take into account the real wage effects. And essentially, it really halves the food security effects that before they estimated it was 190 million people became poor, now they say 90 million if they correct for these labor effects. We have also found these labor effects to be very important in our supply chain analysis, and basically there's also important gender effect potentially depending on whether it's mostly women or mostly men who are being employed. I have, this is a slide from our studies which we've done. This is in the exports of fruit and vegetables in Senegal. We followed them for more than 10 years now. And essentially what we've seen, there's been a big increase in exports from this is the most important fruit and vegetable producing region in Senegal, a big increase in exports there. But in recent time, what we've seen, there's been a shift from smallholder contracting for these export vegetables to increasingly larger scale production system, but we're hiring people to come and work on the farms, okay? And so we've been measuring the poverty and the income effects of that and the food security implications, and we've seen that the biggest effects, and they're really big, this is incomes that go ×3 for farmers or households who can produce as smallholder farms for this export change. But the income effect for households where one of the members of the household is actually being employed on these larger companies exporting is also ×2 in terms of income. So it's really, really big effect. And these are the poorest people in the region. Essentially, this makes a difference between under and over the poverty line. And of course, that affects food security. My final point is on, it's part of the same spillover story. What we see is that in almost all these cases, okay, when we talk about food imports or export, usually it includes a whole bunch of different things, okay? So it includes staple foods, but it also includes fruit and vegetables and whatever sugar. And so what we've seen is that rural households who can participate in the supply chain for exporting, that there's not only through their income an impact on their food security, but often also a kind of technology spillover on the food production itself on the farm. And that's because they learn better management techniques, they get access to better technology, which could be, for example, organic fertilizer, better inputs, which they also then use not only on the cash crop production, but also on their food production. And they have also, because they got income in other seasons, it means they suddenly have cash in a season where they're normally hungry, and they can buy food. And of course, it gives them a certain insurance, which basically gives kind of in missing insurance markets, okay? And so we've had a number of case studies where we find, okay, because we weren't really know what to expect, that these effects can actually be really can really be large in terms of for household welfare. I've listed some more info here, and thank you very much.
Thank you both, Kim and Joe. Those were a great set of comments, and there's so much to talk about. So I'm going to, while you're thinking of your questions, since I had several questions myself, I'm taking the prerogative of the moderator to start it off. And Joe, I liked how you emphasized the labor impacts and the labor effects and how that is often underestimated when we're looking at these price shocks. Neither of you talked much about how land markets operate in these general equilibrium markets or models, and land values have clearly increased with rising prices, but land markets are quite uncertain in sub-Saharan Africa. I think, Joe, what struck me in your last set of slides there was that contract farmers actually could make quite a bit more than if you're just employed. So is it worth trying to sort out the the land markets as well as trying to get the prices right? So this is to both of you because land seemed somewhat buried in your models.
Go first.
Certainly that fits into Joe's heading of institutions, and getting property rights sorted out is obviously one of the key ways to begin economic growth. And land markets in an agrarian economy is certainly the most important asset alongside mineral assets. So getting that right is obviously going to matter a lot. And the possibility of contract farming is one option, leasing, doing sharecropping, all of those become more possible once you have well-defined property rights. There's one other area that I think also needs stressing when looking at the indirect effects that can come from a shock such as changing trade barriers that came up in the global and the national general equilibrium models we were using to look at poverty and inequality. And that was when you alter a trade barrier, for example, you lower or eliminate a tariff on imports, that has a government revenue effect that may be non-trivial in a very poor country. And so the government suddenly has less money to spend. And so what matters then is what do they do in that, as part of that package? Do they raise domestic taxes somehow? And so in the work that Tom Hertel did, especially in that book, he looked at different ways in which you might, for example, impose a consumption tax, like a VAT or something, to capture or to replace that government revenue that was lost. And what matters in terms of the poverty effects is who is affected by that tax, and do you tax things that poor people eat, or do you avoid poor people in bringing that higher domestic tax? It turns out to make a massive difference to the effect. So that's two areas, I think, the labour market or factor markets more generally, and the taxation issue that might follow from that. I think the other factor market obviously is capital, and how do people get finance, and that's a crucial restriction also on agricultural development of small farmers, just not being able to get credit.
Thanks. Joe, you want to?
Yeah. Thanks, Ross. I mean, obviously, this is a very important issue, okay, and I'm not really sorry for not mentioning it, but because I would have had more time, but yes, evidently it's a really important thing, and now with the increased global demand for food and the increased investments in Africa, I mean, I'm sure you know very well, there's definitely a need for more transparent property rights, I think, or the demand will make that, is already making that very much necessary. There's going to be I mean, that these property rights are going to come under pressure, whether they're informal, whether they're communal, whether they are basically run in various different ways. So that is certainly a very important issue to follow up. In the particular cases that we have studied in, okay, it's been the case that for example, in the Senegal case where we studied, there we've seen a shift from smallholder contracting to large-scale production. And this large-scale production is essentially taking place on land which was either not used before, or it was used by basically state farms which had gone bankrupt or things like that. So the large-scale development, if you want, of the farms, and these are not like 100,000 hectare farms, okay, there are a couple of hundreds or so. They are actually in parallel with the households, and so the households, even the people where household members are working on the farms, they still keep their own plots of land which you had before, and they keep growing food there. So there is not Senegal in that in that way, or on this issue I mean, land is relatively available, and so the issue is mostly an issue of putting infrastructure and irrigation in it, rather than, so water is in a way more scarce thing than land. In Madagascar it's very different, and their land is very scarce, and what we've seen there is that there has not been a development of large-scale farming, and mostly it's entirely smallholder based, and essentially somehow the companies have to work with whoever is on the land, and they don't. Okay, but I don't want to make these seem to me as pretty happy developments, and I'm sure that there's other cases going on. So I don't think we can just extrapolate from that. There's no problem there also.
Yeah, that's good. Question? Yeah, in the back here.
Johan, I think I heard you say that there was a big difference.
Can you
Yes,
say who you are too when you start?
Elton Sherwin. And Johan, I think I heard you say there's a big difference between whether you hired men or women, and then you moved on to the next topic. Could you talk a little bit more about how it's different?
Yeah. Again, this is on the in the supply chains what we looked at. Okay, for example, these vegetable, horticulture and horticultural export chains. We've seen that on the the labor market effect is typically the contract farming, the contracts with the head of the household, and that's typically a male person, okay? But at least in the cases we've seen, right? And it may be different in different parts of Africa. But the hiring is typically women, okay? And that means if you have the shift from smallholder systems to larger scale employment, okay, where more people get hired to work on the farms, okay, that basically does not only affect the structure of the farming system, but also the type of people who get involved, and in this case, the gender effects. So it's mostly women who get employed. In some regions, 90% of the employees are women on these companies. And this has, we're right now collecting data on trying to get precise information how that's affecting the households, okay? But we already see from our preliminary observation that it's really affecting spending, education of the children and stuff. I mean, I'm sure there's people in the room who know more about gender issues than I do and who can tell you that, and that's also what we observe.
I think it's important too to remember it's not just employment on the farms that matters, but off farm. So if new activities such as exporting processed product or even just packaged products arises, then there's a need for a processing or a packaging plant and transport to get the goods from the farm to there and from there to the airport or the port, and that those jobs grow very rapidly once new export markets open up, and the fruit and vegetable area especially is important there. And I think the most striking example I've seen of that in the last 30 years has been Chile, because it moved down that direction very strongly, selling into the US market with horticultural products. And the fear was that a lot of poor small maize growers and so on would be harmed by the competition that these folks created and the exchange rate appreciation and so on. But on the contrary, these maize farmers continued to do their part-time farming and then got jobs in these processing or packing outfits and so on.
Other questions? Yeah, Tim.
Tim Josling, FSI. Thanks a lot for the comments, Kim and Yo, they were great. And although I'm not a student, Roz, I guess I always feel I learn a lot from these two gentlemen. My question really is largely to Kim, but I'm sure that Yo will have something to say on it. The issue of trade liberalisation that you mentioned, the sort of implicit model that you were using was sort of unilateral trade liberalisation, and then later on you came along and said this is a good argument for the Doha round concluding and so on. But in fact, in Africa, there's been a lot of something in between the two, and that is the growth of regional organizations. There have been dozens of regional organizations in Africa for years, but at last they're beginning to look serious and actually have some impact on trade. And secondly, of course, the preferential agreements, again with the EU for years, but now with the turning those preferential agreements into proper free trade areas, which is a process which is going rather slowly, and you might better tell us a bit about that. So my question really is, you know, what's the role of these both the regional agreements on the one hand and the preferential or post-preferential agreements on the other with the US and Europe in terms of food security for Africa?
Thanks, Tim. I think one of the reasons there hasn't been much action out of regional agreements in the distant past was that there are still these very high trade costs in Africa, and so with increased interest in signing onto them now, and if there's simultaneously an increased interest in lowering trade costs, getting roads and so on going, but also trade facilitation things like lowering customs clearance nuisance things, that can potentially make those regional arrangements work. And there's a very low share of trade in agricultural products in Africa that is intra-African. So the scope for that is quite large, it seems to me. And if every country wasn't also insulating itself from price movements, then that would increase the possibilities of that. So hopefully these trade agreements could include commitments to not, for example, alter export barriers when prices move around. That could be a precursor to getting the WTO to focus on that question again. I didn't mention the non-reciprocal preferential arrangements that used to be in place, like the Cotonou agreement, for example, with the EU. But I was reminded of it again when Joe gave his example of the way in which the policy discussion went pre-2008 and post-2008 with people in the bank and the World Bank and other places pushing for trade liberalisation, reductions of agricultural protection on the grounds that would improve a lot of the poor in developing countries, and then putting this opposite story later. Well, a similar sort of situation occurs with these preferential agreements that were non-reciprocal, with the Europeans providing access into their markets for farm products that were highly protected in those markets against others' imports. And so when Europe liberalised, as it has done a lot since the mid-80s, that margin of preference has diminished over time, and so those countries that had that access have had less of that in more recent times, less access, and therefore have actually lost from that. Well, the magnitude of that's not all that large, because there is a lot of friction in those non-reciprocal agreements that meant that the trade wasn't all that large in any case for lots of situations. But certainly some countries have lost from that, and that does need to be taken into account when doing this type of analysis. It's just another reminder of how complex the distributional effects are when you liberalise trade, even though overall the world economy is going to be better off and many national economies are going to be better off, but there will be a lot of distributional effects.
Fran, sorry.
I just had a question about whether you thought national stocking policies could play any role in mitigating the effect of international price movements.
Yeah, I think they can. They generally stuff it up. So if you can reduce that, it's probably a good thing on average. But that's being too crass. It was the case for many decades that national stock holdings were quite large, the US and China and so on. And in the 90s, we saw that diminish a lot in grains, and that's set us up for a situation where, with a few weather shocks at one time and low aggregate stocks, you could get a price spike, and we saw that in 2008. What we've seen since, I think, is some sensible responses to that issue, and in the case of rice, coordination across the Asian countries in knowledge about their reserves and so on. And that itself, I think, has already had an impact, even if it hasn't led to transfers of grain across countries or anything from those stocks. Just the fact that people know there are stocks there and they don't need to panic buy, and so we haven't seen a repeat of that mid-2008 panic by the Philippines, for example. So it can have that sort of role. In general, though, I think government's getting into this business, and it seems like they're getting into it more. Indonesia's talking about getting back into it a bit, and we've seen some Eastern and Southern African countries do it. And generally they don't do it very well. Their timing's not good, there's room for corruption, all of those things, and it crowds out private stock holding at the same time. So if you were going to get involved at all as a government, the first best thing might be to subsidise private stock holding and just let them make the decisions about when to buy and sell.
Kim, can I press you on this a little bit? So on the rice market, for example, because if you look at the official data right now, it looks like stocks have been improving relative to certainly maize, but maybe on wheat as well. But you're talking about these government-to-government discussions and sorting out stocks so that everyone has it available. I'm always under the impression with rice that it is government-to-government. And how much is transparent? What do we not know in this market? How volatile is it because it tends to be more government-to-government and not, there's not a Chicago Board of Trade in rice, for example, and not the transparency. Are you really complacent that these kind of arrangements will make everything more stable?
No, but I think if we do a lot of the other things, like getting out of varying our trade barriers, that can make things more stable, and the scope for doing that is enormous. So there wouldn't be as much need for this stock holding and panicking and so on if there wasn't the fluctuations in prices that are driven by those variations in trade restrictions. But I think there probably also is some uncertainty that's very difficult to get on top of if countries like China don't want to disclose what their stocks are, or don't want to disclose accurately what they are, or can't do it because they don't know how to measure it, for example, if there's a lot of household stock holding. And then if countries like Burma join the game and we're unfamiliar with how they might operate, that could be another contributor to uncertainty. So there's probably a high premium on just getting better information about stocks, and that would just reduce, if the stocks are in fact quite a bit bigger than we imagine because we just can't measure it, then that itself could ease concerns on the market.
Okay, good, thank you.
Can I just
Yeah,
add
yeah,
one little
yeah,
thing on
yeah.
the stock issue? I just finished, I was asked to write a paper on the impact of the food price volatility on policies in the EU, agricultural policies and food policies in the EU. And so we basically I got the data together on stocks and on food aid of the EU, and it's extremely paradoxical what has happened there is that it comes back to the right of food argument from the very beginning, that in 1980s and early 1990s, okay, the EU had huge stocks, okay, and so their policy was very much distorting global prices and global markets with the subsidized exports, etc. And at that point, of course, there was no upward price spikes and now they have removed all that and the stocks are essentially zero. And so now it would be a period when food aid could maybe play, I don't know, but essentially the EU hasn't used any food aid for the past 3 or 4 years. And so we have, I don't know if it's a cynical argument or not, but that's just what the situation is. What reality is that when we shouldn't have used it, we used it, and now where it may have played a role in stabilizing some of it, we don't have it anymore.
That goes back a long way to early 1950s and so on with USAID or other food aid. Yeah.
Yep, over here.
Hi there. You both hit on two, I thought, incredibly powerful points. Johan mentioned how institutions do matter, and Cam, you mentioned how the best way to enhance food security is to efficiently raise spending power. So if you take a look at the difference, I guess the one deciding factor into why you have very wealthy nations versus very poor nations, it seems to be that one determining factor is the quality of institutions. You have two types, economic institutions and political institutions. In regards to political institutions, it seems as if you have fairly poor levels of political institutions in some of the LDCs, and as a result, the form of government, constraints on politicians, and separations of powers, those things don't exist on the same scale as, say, in the developed countries like the United States and Europe. As long as those, I guess, weak links exist, it sort of seems to me as if you're going to always have a difficult time raising not only just the GDP of these nations, but also being able to have that impact the income of the people to be able to affect food security. I was hoping that maybe Kim could address that a little bit in terms of the quality of political institutions in these countries.
Well, I'm no expert in that area, but certainly the development literature has moved very heavily in that direction of looking at the role of institutions in economic development, and it's undoubtedly the case that it has a huge impact. I guess there'll just be ongoing work in that area, but it's not something I've worked on. Maybe, Joe, you'd want to comment since you've been working a bit more on that.
Yeah, there's a really big China expert here in the room, right? So, and China has done very well in food security response. So, I'm sure that it's, and also the studies I've seen who've just put in political institutions as a variable in the explanation, the impact is it's not particularly clear. Okay, and so, I totally agree with the statements you made, okay, but whether, let's say, democracies have done better in terms of helping food security than non-democracies, I think it's much less simple, I think, than you would normally intuitively think for. What is true, though, is that what we do have done an analysis on, and that paper is appearing in the World Bank Economic Review next month, is that we took Kim's NRA data, right? And there we saw that when you have political reforms in developing countries, in any country, but most of it, the political reform have been in poorer countries, and you move from a dictatorship to a democracy, to put it simple, that it did affect agricultural policies actually, and it has essentially, it's consistent, the evidence that we find is consistent with the fact that in countries where farmers are a majority, which is typically in poor countries, okay, that there, if you have a more democratic government, that government is more likely to support farmers, okay, which then make the majority, which is consistent with the. So, I mean, I think that's a good thing, okay. That is consistent with the evidence that yes, a more democratic political institution would actually help, right?
I think it's good up to the point where they remove the taxation of agriculture, and then it becomes a bad when they go beyond that, and that's where we're seeing Indonesia.
Chinese are doing that as well.
Yeah, China, Indonesia, and India are all moving in that direction. So they, on average, had close to zero nominal rates of assistance in the 90s. Now they have an average of 10 to 20%, depending on the country and the year. So they've already gone that way, and the question is, will they keep on going that way like Korea, Taiwan, Japan did before them? Joe was also involved in a political economy book that we put together a couple of years ago that did do some econometric work on this issue, and particularly on Africa, and Bob Bates, for example, was doing some of that work on Africa, and he showed there was a lot of institutions that mattered, not just sort of dictator versus democracy, but where the president came from a rural electorate or an urban one, and what type of crops were growing in that electorate, and that type of thing really made a difference to the outcomes. So moving to democracy doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes here, where we're seeing Japan and Europe stuff up world markets for 50 years and no democracies. It's.
I'm going to let Scott defend himself for a second here. He's raising his hand as the...
Actually, this is on a previous issue that was raised, and it was looking at these export subsidies, or to use your words, seem to have been stuffing up the prices for the last few years. And my question is really one of, are these going to get onto the reform agenda if trade talks resume? And why were they never negotiated before? Was it because we had these 100 years of falling prices, so no one worried about them? Or were there interests in the negotiations that blocked them from going on? I just know from discussions with Chinese officials that they say they'll never agree to export restrictions sort of being taken out of their hands. I mean, that's a strong statement, but sort of what's the historic background, and is it more possible for trade talks to resume at all? And if they do you think export restrictions will be high on the agenda?
Well, I can't give you a good answer on that last question about whether they will resume at all, but one hopes that this isn't the end of that process. But why it hasn't happened in the past, I think you're right, the long run decline in prices in the period since the GATT was formed in 47 probably meant it wasn't on the agenda as a big issue necessarily. The other thing is that they were being practiced, where they were being practiced was in the newly independent developing countries who either weren't members of the GATT or weren't active. And so it wasn't an issue for them. It has certainly come under fire now. I think Japan was the most recent, the earliest of the recent claimants here to try and get this on the agenda to the Doha round. Before that, in fact, 1990, I think. And then others have come on board, other food importing countries have come on board and saying there's an asymmetry here, we're disciplining ourselves on import restrictions, why shouldn't we on export restrictions, which is a fair enough comment. But the reason it hasn't happened is that there, not only China, but countries like Argentina have been vehemently opposed to restrictions on the restrictions, and they themselves have been increasing their export taxes over the last period since their devaluation in 2001. And they're an average order of magnitude of 30% or so on primary agricultural exports at the moment, wine excluded, so that's why wine has boomed as an export item. It's a processed product, they would say.
David?
David Lobel from FSE. You both mentioned infrastructure investment and R&D spending, and I think other things that I would maybe classify as a subsidy to agriculture, but are don't seem to be included in any of the official sort of taxation subsidy kind of measures. And also you mentioned how the trend has been sort of less promising on that front than on the protection taxation front. And I guess my question is there any evidence that the two are connected somehow, that as governments become less reliant on taxation for revenue, which you mentioned, are they less either compelled or less likely in some way to actually make those investments in rural infrastructure, in R&D, which have huge sort of amplifying effects? So it would seem that would severely maybe dampen the benefits of cutting taxation, you know, if I'm thinking about this right, or maybe not, because it's very different pieces of the production picture.
Well, I think there's two elements to it. One is time dimension. So these investments are typically long payoffs. So even though the payoff might be high, it's a long time coming. And so as countries become more democratic, and so even before they're still subject to popular support, needing popular support. And so they tend to favour short-term expending issues that will give them votes rather than the longer term ones. So that's one element, I think. Another is that there is a component of a public good here, or a problem of free riding in the case of agricultural R&D investments. So if the investments can't be just private sector driven because you can't capture the value of the seed you produce or whatever, then there's a problem of underinvestment there that can be solved by the government providing support for that program. It doesn't mean the government has to do the R&D, but it needs to provide the support. And the way that has evolved over time is to try and get it to be shared. So if you had a closed economy, the benefits of R&D spending on agriculture would be shared as between producers and consumers. The price would drop if you were successful in that exercise in lowering the supply curve. And so consumers and producers would benefit, so that'd be fine. But in an open economy where you're exporting that and you're a small supplier and your technology is only affecting you, then your farmers are the sole beneficiaries of that. And so they should pay most of the share of that. So we've had a big debate in Australia recently about this, where currently the program is one-for-one subsidy from the government. Farmers put in $1 and the government puts in $1. And the argument was, well, most of these benefits stay with the farmers, so they should pay most of it. But there are spillovers not only to consumers, but to the science community more broadly, insofar as it might have some basic science consequence of doing that applied work. And so that's another reason for their having the social rate of return from that investment being higher than the private rate generally, and hence the argument for government inclusion. So I think it's that sort of reasoning that was probably in the minds of the people that designed the PSC arrangement. Actually, Tim can tell us about that. That came into being in the 80s in the OECD, and before that in the 70s in the FAO, where they put them into a category, those sorts of things, into a category that was considered non-distorting. It's certainly not directly price distorting to the product in the market. It might be shifting the supply curve out more than otherwise.
Molly?
Can I add on 1 second on that? It's great. I hadn't thought about that question for a long time. I have a chapter in my PhD on that, actually, from a political economy perspective. And the way we did it, we looked at, sorry, this is a bit of a conceptual answer, but so Kim said if you have a flat demand curve, essentially, and all the benefits go to to producers, right? But in many developing, which is true in an open economy, but in many, typical for rich countries is that the demand curve for agricultural products is fairly inelastic, right? Which means that if you shift out the supply curve, there's a big price effect, okay? And so our political economy model had, if that's the case, then if the government has to make joint decisions on R&D and on subsidies, right, it would essentially give R&D with subsidies in rich countries and R&D without subsidies in poor countries, because they're you don't need essentially you compensate the producers for basically R&D so that the consumers can benefit in rich countries and you don't need to do it in rich countries. And we actually did an empirical analysis on that with data, and I thought there's no way we could ever find it, and actually came out of the data. Okay. Now, of course, this was a lot of things have changed since over the past 10, 15 years with the WTO agreements and with changes in policies, etc. But I think there's an argument there. And then, of course, different departments make different decisions, etc. But it's, I mean, at least in the data we had and the analysis we did, it was consistent with that.
Wally.
Wally Falcon. Kim, could you talk a little bit about the role of the African nations in the trade negotiations? Are there easy generalizations there? Are they a neutral body? Are they coming along kicking and screaming? Do the cries of self-sufficiency dominate everything? Can you talk a little bit more about the role of the nations in that process? Assuming that there is a process sometimes.
That's right. It seems like ancient history now, doesn't it? We haven't had much negotiation for a while. But looking back at the time when I was at the bank and it was hot and leading up to the 2005 Hong Kong WTO ministerial, that's when that book that Will and I put together came out, and and others were doing similar work. And so it was literally in the news every day, and people were discussing it. And I remember one event at which the agricultural ministers for Africa got together in, I think it was Cairo, and they got huge news coverage because they all agreed that they've got to really push for getting rid of these agricultural subsidies. And it seemed to us that was a small part of the total story, production subsidies plus export subsidies. And so we did some quantitative work on that and showed that of the benefits that would come from liberalising agricultural markets globally in total, 93% of the benefits would come from reducing import market access and only 7% from those subsidies, getting rid of those subsidies. So there was a logic in what they were doing politically, I suppose, because a lot of those African countries had import restrictions they didn't want to lower for political reasons. But I think there was also a misunderstanding about the relative importance of subsidies, and so the rhetoric changed as a consequence of that work, and I think that probably helped to push the agricultural agenda along, maybe to the point of killing it. I mean, maybe we overdid it. The thing ground to a halt because the Europeans wanted subsidies to be emphasised because that meant more adjustment on the part of the Americans, and they didn't want import restrictions to be mentioned so much because that was where most of their support was coming from. So it did alter the political economy of the negotiations, I think, to have developing countries now pushing more heavily for that. But there, amongst that group, and including in Africa, there was a large proportion who still were worried about having to open up their own markets to more imports. How that will be now, I don't know. I think it's changing a lot, I think, and if you can remember that slide I had where there'd been that huge change in the distortion to China especially, and so China has been able to, and India also, be able to retain its self-sufficiency in farm products over a very long period of rapid economic growth, which is very unusual, especially for densely populated countries. And if you think what the world would have been like had they not done that, or had they already not had negative assistance there and so didn't change anything, there would have been a huge increase in world prices as a consequence for farm products. And I think now the continuing industrial growth in China that is driving this demand for minerals and energy raw materials is similarly impacting hugely on world primary product markets, and it necessarily has impacts on agriculture insofar as you get Dutch disease effects in countries that suddenly have a mining boom. So there's still a lot to be looked at, I think, and I think we're into a world where things may be not so easily predicted as they were in the past now, with China now so big in these markets, and China and India together are 40% or something of the world food market. So what they do matters to not just minerals and energy markets and greenhouse gases and all that, but also to the food economy.
Did you want to add?
No, fine,
Okay, we'll take one more question from Bill. Here.
Thanks. My question is really getting back to one of the more basic points from Kim Anderson's presentation, and I think that a lot of what I'm thinking about you've sort of implied, but I want to give you a chance to comment on it explicitly. You talk a lot about the effects on deficit-producing countries and the effects on surplus-producing countries. And I'm thinking in particular of the slide you had where you compared the price spikes domestically to international price spikes with and without these trade restrictions. If I'm a policymaker in a deficit-producing country, and particularly with a large share of deficit-producing households, and I look at those figures, I would say, okay, thank you for validating my policies. I'm going to go on with my export bans. But I think particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, it is important now for maybe a small number of countries, but probably a growing number of countries who switch back and forth between deficit and surplus production from year to year. So what do those numbers mean to those countries?
Well, I think the key point here is that you're exactly right, that from an individual country's point of view, the politician there is going to be worried about the next election or the next time he has to face the public, and so they will take that populist view and try and reduce the extent to which that price spike gets transmitted domestically. The point I was trying to make, I think, was that that if many countries do this, and if an equal number of exporters and importers do it, I didn't show you a slide, but in the case of rice, it's almost equal between the exporters and the importers that impacted on that price rise in 2008. If many do it, and equally it's exporters and importers, it's basically a futile game, except for the people whose country is not engaged in that activity, and they're made worse off by this exacerbated increase in the price. So it's a negative sum game, really, if that's the case. So the only thing you can expect then is that countries get together multilaterally, and that's what we do on the general trade liberalisation side since the GATT was formed, and that's what we need to do also with respect to this question if we're worried about this volatility of prices. And if volatility of prices is going to increase because of lower public stock holdings than we've had in the past and because of climate change and so on, then this issue is not going to go away. And so it does seem to me a legitimate topic to bring to the multilateral community and try and get agreement to desist in that action. It's a free rider problem. Individual countries will keep doing it while other countries keep doing it.
Want to add anything, John?
Yeah, I'll just add an anecdote. I did a lot of work in Eastern Europe in the 1990s, and I was in Bulgaria in, I must have been 95 or something. And Bulgaria is a traditional grain exporter, big grain exporter. And that was a time when prices came down with the liberalization, etc. And so in 2 years' time, every time there was a rumor that that the food price, the grain price, the bread price would go up in Bulgaria because they had to import bread, and they fired the Minister of Agriculture. So they went through 7 Ministers of Agriculture in 2 years' time. So the political just to illustrate that the political incentives are there to introduce these bans.
I like the ending on let's gossip about the real people on the ground. So let's move to the reception and thank both Kim and Joe for great presentations, great set of answers. Thank you.